any worry going on in the WNBA executive offices, if there is no worry, oh, people aren't going to turn off, oh, people are still going to show up, if that was the thought that they were having up there in WNBA La La Land, well, now might be the time to hit the panic button. 48 hours after news hits that Caitlin Clark is injured and she'll be missing 2 weeks, the market has responded and the market has told the WNBA.
No doubt that's about to happen. The WNBA teams that move their games, this is about to be catastrophic for them.
The WNBA just got hit with the one thing they were never fully prepared for. Not a bad trade, not a scheduling conflict, not a PR controversy. Something far more revealing. Their single biggest draw, the player who single-handedly rewrote what women's basketball looks like on a business level, just went down with a quad injury. And within 48 hours, the market responded in a way that should terrify every executive sitting in a WNBA boardroom right now. Because here's what makes this moment so significant. It isn't just about one player missing 2 weeks of games. It's about what happens when you spend months downplaying someone's influence, only to watch the entire financial structure of your league start trembling the moment she steps off the court.
But we don't want this. What am I talking about? Indiana Fever ticket prices to games over the next 2 weeks have dropped 42% since Caitlin Clark's injury announcement, an average ticket price of $137.
If you've been following this situation, you already know this story runs a lot deeper than a quad strain. And if you're new here, stick around, because what's unfolding right now is one of the most fascinating case studies in modern sports economics you'll ever see. And before we go any further, if you find this kind of deep dive content valuable, go ahead and drop a like and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps, and there's a lot more coming your way. Caitlin Clark suffered a quad injury that sidelined her, with Indiana Fever head coach Stephanie White telling reporters she would be reevaluated in approximately 2 weeks. On the surface, that sounds manageable. 2 weeks, reevaluate. Maybe she's back before the situation spirals too far. But anyone who understands how quad injuries actually heal knows that 2 weeks is the most optimistic possible reading of that situation. Quad injuries are notoriously stubborn. The quadriceps muscle group handles an enormous amount of load during explosive movements, cutting, driving to the basket, defending in a stance. Even when the initial damage appears minor, pushing a player back too soon risks turning a 2-week absence into a 6-week problem or worse. What makes this even more worth paying attention to is that Clark reportedly dealt with quad issues during the preseason. So this isn't a fresh, isolated incident. There's a history here. And when you hear that a player who had preseason quad trouble is now out with another quad injury midseason, serious questions start forming about whether the right precautions were ever taken in the first place.
I don't know when it happened. I know afterwards, we got a message that she had something going on with her leg, and they were getting an MRI, and we got the news yesterday.
Was it after the Liberty game on Saturday?
Is that her last game?
Yeah.
Yes.
Steph, you had a chance to try out a lot of...
The honest range we're looking at is somewhere between 2 and 6 weeks. And in a WNBA season that's already significantly shorter than the NBA calendar, that window represents a massive chunk of games, many of which were already sold and marketed around one specific person's presence. Here's where the abstract conversation about star power stops being theoretical and starts being measurable. Within 48 hours of the injury announcement, Indiana Fever ticket prices dropped 42%. Let that land for a second. 42%. The average ticket price before the news broke was sitting around $137. That's not a casual figure. That's legitimate demand, real money from real fans who were actively choosing to spend it on attending these games. The moment Clark was out, that demand evaporated at a pace that should shake the league to its core. Social media made the fan reaction even clearer. People weren't quietly adjusting their plans. They were openly announcing their decisions. One fan posted that they were selling their tickets to the Fever versus Mystics game because they had no interest in traveling from Washington to Baltimore without Clark on the court. Another said they would only watch Fever games on a tape delay to avoid contributing live viewership numbers to the league. These aren't isolated complaints. They're coordinated intentional responses from a fan base that feels like the league never fully respected the player who brought them into the fold.
Yeah, I don't know how things work in pretend basketball. I don't know the history of transparency when it comes to timelines for injury returns in the WNBA. But I do know in the NBA, teams are rarely transparent with injuries. When the Pelicans say Zion Williamson will be reevaluated in 2 weeks,
and that's what separates this moment from a typical star injury situation. This isn't just disappointment. There's an underlying anger here that has been building for a while. The injury didn't create it. The injury just gave it a visible outlet. Now here's where things get genuinely uncomfortable for several franchises. Because multiple WNBA teams made significant logistical and financial commitments based on the assumption that Caitlin Clark would be on the court. The Washington Mystics relocated their matchup with Indiana to a Baltimore facility that holds 15,000 people. The Chicago Sky moved their game to the United Center, which is the same building where the Chicago Bulls play. The Dallas game was relocated to the American Airlines Center, home of the Dallas Mavericks. These are not small decisions. Moving a game to a larger venue means venue rental fees, additional staffing, expanded security, upgraded production, and full-scale marketing campaigns. Every dollar of that spending was justified by one core assumption, that Caitlin Clark would be playing and fans would show up in massive numbers to see her. Without her, these teams are now staring down the possibility of performing in front of partially empty arenas that were never going to be filled by any other draw on the current roster. And the visual of thousands of vacant seats in a venue that was specifically expanded to meet demand is genuinely damaging in a way that goes far beyond one bad night of ticket sales. Television cameras don't miss those shots. Sponsors watch those images closely, and media narratives form quickly when the optics are that stark. The teams that made these calls weren't reckless. They were responding rationally to a market signal that said Caitlin Clark drives extraordinary demand. The problem is the league never built a system where that demand could be distributed more broadly, and now those franchises are absorbing the full risk of that failure. This is the part of the conversation that gets genuinely uncomfortable, because it requires being honest about something the league has resisted acknowledging for most of this season. From the moment Caitlin Clark entered the WNBA, there was a visible tension. On one hand, the league wanted everything that came with her arrival. The ratings, the sponsorship interest, the sold-out venues, the mainstream media attention. On the other hand, there seemed to be a persistent discomfort with the narrative that one player was responsible for the majority of that growth. Players commented publicly about how the spotlight needed to be shared. Media figures debated whether Clark was getting too much attention at the expense of other talented women in the league. The league itself seemed to walk a careful line, never fully embracing the Clark effect, while simultaneously benefiting from every piece of it. Here's the fundamental problem with that approach. You cannot build your entire marketing strategy around someone's presence, profit from every ticket sale and broadcast deal that comes with it, and then spend your public messaging suggesting she isn't actually that central to your success. That's not a sustainable position. It creates confusion in the market, frustration among fans who feel like their enthusiasm is being managed rather than welcomed, and ultimately, it prevents the league from doing the one thing it actually needed to do: convert casual Clark fans into genuine WNBA fans. That conversion is the whole game when a transcendent talent enters your league. You use the star as a bridge. You introduce casual viewers to other players, other storylines, other reasons to keep watching when that star has an off night or misses a few games. The NBA has done this brilliantly throughout its history. Individual stars create entry points, and smart leagues turn those entry points into lasting relationships. That work, by most accounts, was never seriously done. And what we're seeing now is the direct consequence of that oversight. To understand why this moment is so significant, you need to look at the numbers from earlier in the season, because they tell a story the league should have been paying far more attention to. When Caitlin Clark was playing, WNBA games were pulling viewership numbers that the league had never seen before. Games that would typically attract around 200,000 viewers were suddenly drawing over 1 million. Arenas that had historically struggled to fill 5,000 seats were selling out venues that held 20,000. These weren't gradual increases. These were dramatic, sudden jumps that tracked almost perfectly with Clark's involvement. That data points to something very specific. The new audience wasn't watching because they suddenly discovered a deep love for the sport. They were watching because of one particular player. And that distinction matters enormously when you're trying to build a long-term business strategy. Casual sports fans are not automatically loyal to leagues. They're loyal to stories, to personalities, to the specific emotional connection they form with an athlete they admire. The NBA understood this with Michael Jordan. The tennis world understood it with Serena Williams. When a once-in-a-generation talent enters the picture, the institution around them has a narrow window to cement a broader relationship with that new audience before the window closes. That window is closing right now, and it's closing during a 2 to 6 week stretch where the league's most important storyline is completely absent. Some people watching from the outside have called the fan boycott an overreaction. The argument goes that supporters should be cheering on the entire league, not just one player, and that pulling back because Clark is hurt is unfair to the other athletes who work just as hard and deserve just as much support. That argument, while well-intentioned, misses the reality of how this audience formed. These fans did not come to Caitlin Clark through the WNBA. They came to the WNBA through Caitlin Clark. That's not a criticism of the league or its other players. It's simply the documented path of entry for millions of new viewers this season. They became invested in one specific person's journey, and the league had every opportunity to use that investment as a foundation for something broader. Instead, the response to Clark's massive popularity was often to frame it as a potential problem rather than an extraordinary opportunity. And fans noticed. They noticed when the narrative shifted away from celebrating what was happening and toward managing expectations about one player's relative importance. They noticed the subtle and sometimes not so subtle resistance. And what you're seeing in the boycott movement is the accumulated frustration of an audience that feels like the league never really wanted them in the way it wanted their money. That's a hard truth, but ignoring it doesn't make it less real. Ticket prices and attendance are just the most visible parts of the damage. The actual financial fallout from Clark's absence runs through multiple layers of the league's business simultaneously. Merchandise sales will drop. When your most popular player isn't playing, the interest in buying her jersey, her branded gear, anything tied to her presence on the court, softens considerably. That's not unique to the WNBA. It happens across every sport. But in a league where merchandise revenue was already heavily concentrated around one player, the effect is amplified. Sponsorship activation becomes significantly more complicated. Brands that sign partnerships with the expectation of being associated with Clark's games now have to navigate how to execute those activations without the primary draw present. Some will pull back. Others will quietly begin reassessing whether the return on investment justifies the cost of the deal. These conversations won't be loud or public, but they will absolutely happen. Media coverage will decline. This is nearly automatic. Sports media follows storylines. And the biggest storyline in the WNBA this season has been Caitlin Clark at every turn. Her absence removes the most compelling daily narrative from the league's rotation, and coverage will shift toward other sports that are generating more compelling moments. Each of these threads compounds the others. Lower attendance leads to worse optics. Worse optics lead to reduced media coverage. Reduced media coverage leads to diminished sponsor interest. Diminished sponsor interest leads to smaller deals in the next negotiation cycle. This is how a momentum-building moment in a league's history can unravel, not through any single catastrophic event, but through a cascade of smaller contractions that all point in the same direction. Perhaps the most difficult part of this entire conversation is the possibility that this situation didn't have to happen this way. When a player demonstrates signs of a recurring injury during the preseason, the professional standard in most elite sports organizations is to be extremely conservative with that player's workload. Load management, modified practice schedules, careful monitoring of minutes and movement patterns. These aren't revolutionary ideas. They're standard practice in the NBA, in elite soccer leagues, in virtually every professional sports organization that understands the business value of keeping its most important players healthy and available. There are legitimate questions about whether those standards were applied appropriately to Caitlin Clark. When preseason quad issues are followed by a mid-season quad injury significant enough to sideline a player for multiple weeks, the natural question is whether the warning signs were taken seriously enough, whether the pressure to capitalize on her popularity in the short term influenced decisions that should have been made purely on the basis of player health. We don't know the full answer to that. Medical situations are complex, and it would be unfair to assume negligence without complete information. But the question deserves to be asked out loud, because if the answer is that short-term revenue considerations played any role in rushing a player back from a legitimate injury, the damage that follows isn't just unfortunate. It's a self-inflicted wound that the league has to own. The WNBA was at a genuinely critical inflection point this season. New television deals were being discussed. Sponsorship interest was at historic levels. Mainstream sports media was paying attention in a way that had never happened before. All of that progress requires consistency. It requires having your most important player available and healthy throughout the season so that the new audience keeps showing up, keeps watching, keeps telling their friends to tune in. You cannot grow a casual audience through intermittent availability. Casual fans are not patient fans. They will find something else to watch. And that something else doesn't have to be another sport. It just has to be something that holds their attention when you can't. There's a deeply ironic quality to where the WNBA finds itself right now, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. For much of this season, the ongoing conversation inside and around the league was centered on the idea that Caitlin Clark's impact was being overrated, that the league's success wasn't dependent on any single player. That women's basketball had depth, talent, and enough compelling storylines to stand on its own without the Clark narrative dominating everything. That argument is about to be tested in the most direct, unambiguous way possible. Over the next several weeks, the WNBA will play games without its most watched player. The attendance numbers, television ratings, merchandise sales, and media coverage during that stretch will paint an extremely clear picture of what the league actually looks like without her. There will be no ambiguity, no complex variables to account for. Just the raw numbers from a stretch of games where the most significant independent variable is her absence. If those numbers hold up, the league's position is vindicated and the conversation shifts permanently. But if those numbers crater, and early indicators suggest they will, every executive, player, commentator, and analyst who spent months arguing that Clark wasn't uniquely central to the league's growth will have to reckon with evidence that says otherwise. This is the great irony of the current moment. The league may have inadvertently created the conditions for the most definitive proof of Clark's importance that anyone could have designed, not through intention, but through a sequence of decisions that prioritized narrative management over honest acknowledgement of what was actually driving their success. The next 2 to 6 weeks are going to be genuinely revealing for the WNBA on multiple levels simultaneously. The league will see exactly what its attendance floor looks like without a transcendent draw. Television partners will get an unfiltered look at what their viewership numbers represent in terms of durable fan base versus star-driven casual interest. Sponsors will be paying close attention. Media outlets will run their own quiet assessments. And when Clark returns, the league will face a choice it has been quietly avoiding all season. Do they finally lean into what she represents for the sport, building genuine marketing infrastructure around her appeal while simultaneously using her platform to elevate other players? Or do they return to the same uneasy compromise, benefiting from her presence while maintaining a public posture of treating her as simply one star among many? The second path has already been tried. The results are playing out in real time right now. 42% ticket price drops, empty seats in arenas that move specifically to hold Clark-driven crowds, fans openly coordinating to withhold their viewership and their money. The WNBA has an extraordinary asset. An athlete who genuinely moved the needle in a way that the league had never experienced before. The question is whether the people running the league are capable of fully embracing that reality and building something sustainable around it, or whether they'll continue to navigate the tension between individual star power and institutional pride until the window that Clark opened starts closing on its own. Because here's the thing about momentum in professional sports. It doesn't wait for organizations to get comfortable. It moves forward or it moves backward, and there's very little middle ground. What's happening in the WNBA right now is genuinely important, not just as a sports story, but as a lesson in how leagues, teams, and institutions handle once-in-a-generation talent. The Caitlin Clark situation didn't have to become a crisis. It could have been, and still could become, the foundation for something lasting in women's basketball. But that requires honesty. Honest acknowledgement of what she brought to the league. Honest evaluation of how she was treated during a period of unprecedented growth. And honest assessment of what the business actually looks like when she's absent. The numbers over the next several weeks will provide that honesty whether the league is ready for it or not. A 42% drop in ticket prices in 48 hours is not a small signal. It's the market speaking as clearly as markets ever do. The question is whether anyone with the power to respond is actually listening. What do you think about everything we just covered? Do you believe the WNBA handled the Caitlin Clark situation correctly? Or do you think they made critical mistakes that are now coming back to haunt them? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. This is a conversation worth having, and the comments section is the place to have it. And if you made it all the way to the end of this video, you already know this channel goes deep on these kinds of stories. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because there's a lot more coming and you do not want to miss what's next.